Good afternoon. I am Rabbi Jeremy Schnyder, Temple Colony in Scottsdale. I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves real fast. Imam?
This is Imam Didmar Faja from the United Islamic Center of Arizona.
Joshua Prather from Redemption Church, Arizona.
And we represent three faith traditions, multi-faith traditions who are in the same community and struggling mightily with this COVID. We wanted to share what we in our communities are thinking about in times of a closure of our houses of worship, and as also plans and things to consider as we move towards reopening our places of worship. There's an ancient principle, a Jewish principle, that described by the Hebrew word keruv, which means to draw close. This principle inspires us in the Jewish community to ask, how do we draw ourselves closer to the Word of God? How does we draw ourselves closer to doing Jewish? How do we draw ourselves closer to community? How do we help draw one another closer to our fellow community members? How can we be magnets that help connect people to our core values and guide our lives? How do we draw close while science tells us that we have to stay away? For my community, I have been driven by the commandment, the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh, an expression that we call saving a life. This mitzvah, this commandment of saving a life, takes precedent over every other commandment in our Torah, in our sacred scriptures. It drives us to recognize that when we go out in public, we are responsible for the health and the safety of every person. But the need and the want as human beings is to draw close. And we have to find ways that are safe as possible to create community and to add meaning to our lives. My hope and my dreams as a rabbi have always been to draw people closer to each other and to their fellow community members. But these times urge us to do so safely. And that's why with our High Holy Days coming up in the next month, we are going to continue to celebrate and meet online through classes and worship, to do so safely and letting this commandment of saving lives be our priority. There is pain, there is sadness, and there is loss of this decision, and I understand and I recognize that, but I also know that our community, we are expressing hope in those who've been blessed with divine wisdom to find a treatment and a vaccine so that we can return to our sacred places and reconnect in person. I know that it's so important for all of us that we've worked to create sacred community and we want to be together, and we will do so. As in Judaism, we love to say l'chaim, to life. And in these challenging moments, I hope and I pray that we can celebrate and we can say l'chaim again together and in person, but we're going to do so safely. And we're going to do so by taking the precautions and considerations that I want to actually pass over to Josh. And as he shares with us, what are some of those things we should be thinking about?
That's good. Thanks, Jeremy. I think there's a great thread that I could draw through that about just caring for lives. So in the Christian tradition, we say that we want to care for all humans because all humans are created in God's image. And if all humans are created in God's image, then every single life is sacred, especially the most vulnerable lives, not just the strong, but especially God has his heart set and his vision set on the weak among us. So how are we doing that? I think just to start the conversation, I think we have to check motives. If I'm talking to any clergy member out there, I think it's really challenging right now because of polarization. So you find yourself, if you stay closed or if you want to open, you automatically find yourself on some end of the political spectrum, which that shouldn't be the case for us. In the Christian tradition, we're trying to think about what honors Jesus the most, how we're caring for our community, and how we're trying to love our neighbor. So that's kind of what motivates us, or what's trying to motivate us as we're thinking about and moving towards reopening. And just as we're thinking about caring for our community, one of the challenges in this, now this is the whole situation is messy and it's not simple, but these are the things we have to consider, and the things that we're considering as a church is how we're caring for people holistically. Because of course, with COVID-19, you're thinking of people's physical well-being. And as I said before, especially the most vulnerable and the weak among us, we have to care about, we have to think about. However, we're recognizing that humans are also created to have a relationship with God. Humans are created to have a relationship with their neighbor. And with separation and isolation, you're seeing abuse go up in homes. You're seeing other challenges like depression and mental health go up. So these are other challenges that we're seeing. And we know one of the solutions for that is community and worship and reconnecting with God and reconnecting with neighbor. So we're trying to think about how we care for our people as we're reopening and caring for them holistically. And we're also trying to think about not just the people that are sitting in front of us in our worship services, but our neighbors as well. I think in America, this becomes really challenging because we look at ourselves as autonomous individuals sometimes that are disconnected from community. But if anything has taught us that we're not, it's COVID-19. So the choices that we make as a place of worship and deciding to reopen has ramifications on the rest of the community. And we are connected to one another. And that's not a bad thing, but it's something that we have to recognize, that our decision affects other faith communities and it affects the neighbors around us. So how are we trying to care and love the most vulnerable neighbors that are around us? And the last thing I want to say is, I think as you're considering this, it's wise to take into consideration your context, because not every context is the same. I was talking to Didmar the other day, and we were having a conversation about someone that might be leading a congregation, a Christian congregation in a retirement community, versus someone that's leading a Christian congregation on ASU's campus. Now, how they're thinking about reopening and who they're thinking about loving and caring for might be different, but these are the questions of trying to care for our people holistically, trying to love the most vulnerable neighbors among us. These are the things that have to be driving us, but the context is going to be different for every single faith community. So my hope is that all the clergy in the city, as they're thinking about reopening, they're doing it with wisdom, and they're doing it out of love for their community and love for the most vulnerable among us. Didmar.
Thank you, Josh. I wanted to continue in those lines that you were mentioned earlier. In Islam too, it's very crucial consideration for the human life. As a matter of fact, one of the primary objectives of the Islamic law is the preservation of human life. And if there is a time like this one where people are obligated to perform the prayers in the mosque, for example, Friday prayer, which is a little bit different from the way how Christians would conduct, their services on Sundays, or the Jewish people would conduct their services. It's slightly different because it is like a mandatory, pretty much, for all of those who fulfill certain requirements amongst the adults, or even young adults for that matter. So we are faced, as Muslims, we're faced with these two difficult decisions to make now. We understand that the human life is sacred and it should be preserved, especially in times like this. But at the same time, we understand that at least Friday prayer, it is mandatory to be performed in the mosque. And that's where the wisdom needs to be applied here. And we have mentioned here in the Valley from the Arizona Council of Mosques that it would be wise to, to cancel the services, including the Friday prayer, especially in those mosques where in the community there is a presence of COVID-19. In other words, community members, they have COVID-19 and they are sick, and there are some communities that have members who have the COVID-19. So, but again, we cannot make this, we cannot say that all of the mosques or all of the houses of worship, they should remain closed, or all of them, they should open at this point. there are some other communities that they don't have members who are sick with the COVID-19. Like, for example, at UICA, the community where I serve, we are not aware of any case there. Therefore, we decided to open the mosque for Friday prayers. But when we open the mosque for Friday prayers, we have limited our services. Usually we would have about 40-minute services. Now we have close to 15-minute services. And of course, we are implementing all of those guidelines that are recommended by the health officials and the government as well. For example, keeping the distance 6 feet apart, making sure that people bring their own sajadas, their prayer rugs. We have placed 2 security guards in the 2 main entrances and the exits outside. So people this way, they cannot congregate outside and start talking. Even when they exit, they have to exit in lines, keeping that distance while they're exiting. And also, like I said, the shortening of the services. And we also have 2 people inside, making sure that everybody is following these procedures. I think these are some very important practical steps that will help any house of worship, not just the mosque, but any house of worship to, to stay safe from this virus, from this pandemic. And also there are some guidelines being posted by the health officials, and I'll be more than glad to share with all of the clerics or rabbis, pastors, and imams in our group, and I will do so later on.